tipping has changed when it comes to DoorDash, Uber Eats, and a lot of other delivery driving services. And I'm going to be honest, you're not going to like this. So, you could already see this. Uber Eats and DoorDash remove tip option in New York City and add another fee. Now, I want to say as a quick side note, if you're thinking like, oh, I don't live in New York City, who cares? Trust me, and I've said this before in a lot of other videos, when a big change happens to Lyft, Uber, in this case, Uber Eats and DoorDash, especially in big areas like California or New York, it does cause, usually, not always, but usually, some type of ripple effect to the rest of the country. So, food delivery app companies, DoorDash and Uber Eats, have significantly changed their services in New York. The apps no longer allow customers, and here's a big thing, to tip at checkout. So when a customer orders delivery, when they order Uber Eats or they order DoorDash, they will not have the option, as you can see here, to tip in the beginning. That means for you as a driver, for all my Uber Eats drivers out there, for my DoorDash drivers out there, etc., when you get an order now, like say New York City and potentially in other places in the country, if they follow suit, you will not be able to see how much they're tipping you until after you drop it off. Not good, right? Instead, a new carrier fee, will be tacked onto the final bill. I mean, there's pros and cons to this. Again, I'll give my recap at the end of this article. But the biggest thing they said is delivery app companies are not thrilled about New York City's new minimum wage rules. I mean, of course they're not, but like, look, I'm glad that it happened with a huge fine and lawsuit that happened with Lyft and Uber. And basically, it demands at least $18 an hour for delivery workers. Companies like DoorDash and Uber Eats have tried to squash the rule, of course, but they had no success. So before the change, delivery drivers made about $7 per hour on average without tips per Business Insider. So, of course, now delivery drivers in New York City are making more money. You know, we have something very similar here in California. I've talked about it in numerous videos called Prop 22. One thing about Prop 22 was a minimum hourly guarantee, which I think is good. Of course, Uber and Lyft doesn't like this. Who cares though, right? Now, here's the big kicker, right? Like I just said, New Yorkers ordering food on DoorDash or Uber Eats can only tip their delivery driver after their order has been picked up or completed. These food delivery companies say they have no choice but to require extra customer costs to compensate for the change. And this is going to be huge, especially in 2024. I know I've done a bunch of videos about 2024, and I know, I'm not going to lie, I'll be honest, I am self-aware. Some of my videos about Lyft and Uber can get a bit repetitive, and I do understand that, right? A lot of times I do try to switch them up a little bit or explain things in different ways, just in case, like, say, one of my videos isn't as clear. So I try to explain it in a different way in another video. So I do know they get a little repetitive. One thing that I will continue to get repetitive about is I do think 2024 is going to be a big year for delivery driving, rider driving, just the gig economy in general. You know, right here, DoorDash said that these new regulations will force us to raise fees for orders in New York City. In order to better balance the impact of these new costs, we're moving the option to tip in the DoorDash app to after checkout. The weird thing, now I know why they're doing this, but I still think it's kind of messed up. Here's the main reason why they're doing this. They're tacking on a new fee, right? So actually go to order a burrito, and the burrito costs $10. And you have all these fees, and then $20. You're like, oh wow, I'm spending $20 for a $10 burrito? Okay, like, yeah, I guess that makes sense. Here's the issue, though. If you then add a tip onto that, let's say you tip 20%, now your total order is $24. So the amount of money that you're spending to get that burrito is a huge amount right in the beginning. However, if let's say you tip at the end, I think psychologically, not even financially, but psychologically, you probably feel like you're not spending as much money for that burrito. You're spending $20, the burrito plus all the fees, and then you tip afterwards the $4. So you're still spending $24 at the end, but it probably doesn't feel like this huge lump sum right in the beginning, which might throw off some people from using these services. DoorDash and Uber Eats claim now that drivers earn about $30 per active hour. I hate when they do stuff like this. That's not true. Meaning the time they spend picking up and delivering food, I'm not going to lie. I don't think that's the case. They said here, it's the new minimum and all this kind of stuff. I don't think that's true. I mean, maybe I would love that. If that actually, let me know for any New York City delivery drivers out there. Are you actually making close to $30 an hour now with this new thing going on? Let me know. That's a good amount, right? And in addition, Uber Eats is following in DoorDash's footsteps. When something happens, and this happens all the time with like the yin and yang of apps, Uber Eats and DoorDash is kind of related to Uber and Lyft, right? When something that happens when a big change happens with Uber, Lyft usually follows suit and vice versa. Same thing when it comes to delivery driving. Uber Eats is also following in their footsteps when it comes to DoorDashing and booting or getting rid of upfront tipping. Tipping will now only be available after your order has been delivered. As always, tipping is optional. I like how they stress this. And here's so annoying. As always, tipping is optional. They didn't have to say that. It cost you no money to literally have to say that. Like, I don't know why they went out of their way to be like, by the way, you don't have to tip, really. Tipping is optional and intended to thank your carrier, excuse me, keep messing that word up, for exceptional service. A spokesperson for Uber Eats said that the additional fees shouldn't discourage customers from paying carriers. I don't know, because going down here now, I'm going to skip over this kind of BS that they're talking about. Let's go right here. This is entirely Uber and DoorDash's own business decision, right? Like, and then said research done by Business Insider concluded that for an order worth about $30, the courier fee will come to be about $2. So it isn't that bad or that big, but as you can imagine, mathematically, when you have tons and tons of orders happening every day, that $2, and I don't know what the average order amount is on Uber Eats or DoorDash in New York City, but that courier fee will eventually add up very fast. Now, I'm curious, for all my delivery drivers out there, what do you think about this? I've done some videos about delivery driving, about Uber Eats and all this kind of stuff, DoorDash and being a DoorDash driver. And one thing I said about delivery driving, which for better or for worse, again, I'm calling it out like it is, delivery driving is really the only service we have that you typically tip on, right? You tip your bartender, you tip your hairdresser, you tip your rideshare driver. Uber Eats and DoorDash and delivery driving is the only service that you tip before it takes place. And I've said this before in other videos. I know some drivers do not want to hear this, but it is just the inevitable truth. There's a lot of good delivery drivers out there who bring it right to your door. They're very respectful. They're very on point. They're efficient. They're amazing. But there's a lot of bad ones too. And there's been some times where I got my entire order screwed up. And one time I ordered a pizza. And when I opened up the pizza box, it almost kind of felt like they spun it around like this or whatever, and then crumbled it up into like a ball in the corner. And I remember opening being like, is this like a ball of pizza? Like, what did I get? And everything was everywhere, right? And to me, and I always have been a big tipper, always, especially for me being, of course, a former Uber and Lyft driver, for me being a former bartender, I'm always been a big tipper. And to me, I'm like, I'm not gonna lie, I don't think they should have deserved a good tip when it comes to that, right? And I know a lot of drivers don't want to hear this, but if, let's say, you destroy someone's order, or, and this has happened to me too, where someone forgets something when it comes to my order, and they're like, oh yeah, sorry, it's in my car, I'll see you in an hour. And I'm like, but I ordered a milkshake in an hour. The milkshake's probably going to be not good, or I don't even know if I can drink it. And it's like, do they deserve a tip? Maybe not. And I know some people watching this video might hate to hear that, but for me being a former bartender, if I was making somebody a drink and I royally screwed it up, and they taste it and they're like, wait, you put this and this and this in it, I didn't want that, this tastes really bad, I can't drink this, and I screwed it up, should I get a tip? Probably not, because it's a service industry, and it's on me, and I messed up their order, right? Now, moving forward, though, when it comes to this, with that being said, I'm curious to see what people think. Because on one end, like I said, from my perspective, they're doing this more from a psychological approach when it comes to more economics, right? Where if, let's say, I said to somebody, and I think they call this a face in the door phenomenon, if, let's say, you're ordering something, and you're like, oh, I'm going to order a $1,000 phone or smartphone, right? And they say, oh, by the way, for an extra $20, do you want a screen protector? You're probably like, all right, yeah, I'm already spending $1,000. Fine. I'll throw in the $20 screen protector. But if they said to you right in the beginning, hey, do you want to pay $1,020 for the phone? There's a certain point where you might be more likely to not buy it. Because even though you're spending the same amount at the end of the day, $1,020, because you're spending way more in the beginning, it seems like a way bigger amount. as opposed to it being broken up, right? So you do a big amount at first, tack on something else way later down the line. So I think this is their approach. They're saying like, look, let's say, again, using this example again, you order a $10 burrito. Like say there's probably not $10 in fees, but let's say there's $5 in fees. 10 plus 5, you're paying $15 for the burrito to come to your door. After it gets there, then they say, oh, by the way, do you want to tip them? And you're right, on a $15 order, $3 is 20%. You then tack on $3. So you in total spend $18 for a $10 burrito. However, if like say they said, hey, do you want to spend $18 for everything right in the beginning? I can see some people saying, no, I'm not going to spend $18 right in the beginning just for a burrito. That's almost double the price of the burrito. And I think this is why they're trying to split up the payments and put the tip at the end. Here's what worries me though, and bothers me for all the delivery drivers out there. That means it is way more acceptable now to not tip your delivery driver. And that's messed up. It is the same situation with Uber and Lyft. And I've done some videos about tipping and tipping culture, how it's so different when it comes to ride sharing. And again, I think these are very similar, ride sharing and delivery driving. Because when I first started driving for Uber and Lyft, and I've mentioned this in other videos, it was really weird. It was a 3-step process. If somebody goes to tip you, you say no. Now, here's what's interesting as a quick side note when it comes to Uber and Lyft that a lot of people don't know. Back in the day, Uber and Lyft's main marketing thing wasn't quick service. It wasn't that you could see the person coming to pick you up. It wasn't that you could hit a button and have the car come to you. One of their biggest selling points, and a lot of people, I think, forget this, or maybe just got into the ride-sharing game a bit later and didn't know that this was their marketing thing, was that it was a cashless transaction. There wasn't this awkward conversation, which always exists. I remember it existed for me when I used to be a bartender, right? Where you're like, cash or credit, and you see them tip you, or they're like, hey, here's, let's say the ride is $30, and they hand you a $50, and you're like, okay, they paid me with a $50, but it was $30 for their order or their ride. Do I give them back 20? Or do I give them back 10 and expect to have 10 for me as a tip? Like, right, there's all these kind of all logistics, and let's be honest, it can be a little bit awkward, right? Especially when it comes to paying a taxi driver, you're paying them right then and there, you're tipping them right then and there, you have this odd exchange with cash. So the idea for Lyft and Uber, especially in the beginning, was to be a cashless transaction. Everything financial is happening behind the scenes that didn't exist person to person with you and your driver, right? So let's say if someone went to tip me, I say, no, we don't accept tips. Because if we did accept tips, that would involve a cash transaction happening in the car, and that would create the awkwardness. So if someone went to tip you, you had to say no. If someone went to tip you again a second time, you're supposed to say, no, sorry, just to reiterate, we don't accept tips. The third time they do, you then say, okay, you know what? I'm going to accept it. Like, you know, if you get pressure and everything, I'm not going to lie, for me, when I was driving, if someone went to tip me, I accept it. I think if I say no, it's almost rude. Like, I remember, which is kind of funny as a side note, when I used to bartend, I bartended in Rome, and my boss's rule was if someone goes to buy me a shot or buy me a beer, or basically buy me a drink, I had to accept that drink. I was not allowed to say no, because if I say no, I'm disestablishing rapport. So let's say it was a crazy night, and I've drank a little too much, where I'm like, okay, probably should slow down a little bit, or maybe not have another shot. I would just say to them, like, hey, you know what? I appreciate you buying me a drink. I'll do a shot of soda with you. Fortunately, I've had already a good amount, but I still want to do a shot with you and accept that drink because I appreciate it, right? So I still feel like that's kind of the same with tipping, right, when it comes to Uber and Lyft, right? So that's the thing, way back when in the day, you really didn't tip your Uber and Lyft driver. Now bring this full circle, or kind of back to this video, this kind of point of this video. With that being said, that's why I think tipping culture 1 wasn't really as relevant with Uber and Lyft, because back in the day, they were telling you, they were going out of their way to tell passengers, do not tip your rideshare driver. Rideshare drivers do not get tips. The second reason why I think when it comes to rideshare driving, now this, again, relates very much so to delivery driving, is there's not an awkward social pressure for you to tip, right? I'm not gonna lie, tipping culture has gotten ridiculous when it comes to other services where, like, say you go somewhere and they do that flip around and they say, the classic line, it's just going to ask you a few questions, right? And they flip it around to some iPad saying, do you want to tip like 30, 35, or 40%? And under 30%, it says good. 35% says great. And then 40% says like excellent or something, which is kind of ridiculous, right? 35%, I mean, that's a crazy tip, unless someone goes really above and beyond. But anyway, with that being said, there is that social pressure. When I used to bartend and let's say I give someone their tab, they're sitting right in front of me. they're gonna like have to, in a sense, have that psychological pressure to tip me, right? I mean, very rarely did I ever get zeroed. In case you don't know, zeroing is kind of like a slang term bartenders use when someone, like, say, goes to buy something and they don't tip you whatsoever. Or you got zeroed is like another way people use it. Very rarely did I get zeroed. Even in Rome, although you don't really tip in Europe, it's very different than America. You know, actually, when I've bartended here, you, of course, always get tips. It's the big thing. When it comes to rideshare driving, though, there's not that social pressure. Meaning, you can get out of that Uber, put your phone away, and it's not like, I'm making this up. It would be very interesting if Uber and Lyft put in a policy would say, hey, you have 1 minute to tip your driver. That means when they pull over, the driver can turn to you, and there's that social pressure to have to tip them. When it comes to a taxi, there's a lot of social pressure because, you know, the second you leave that taxi, if you did not tip them, the taxi driver immediately knows about that you didn't tip him. With rideshare driving, it's this gray area where, like, you might get a tip, you might not. It's super frustrating, and that exists with the lack of social pressure at the end of the ride, and of course the fact that back in the day, you weren't required, you didn't have to tip your rideshare driver. Now bringing this to delivery driving. One, you always really do tip your delivery driving. That's always been a very common thing to tip. So luckily, I don't see that being an issue when it comes to Uber Eats and DoorDash in terms of the culture of tipping changing. But the lack of social pressure, I can see being a big issue and that changing. It can be very easy now for a lot of people in New York City and potentially other cities and states to follow suit, if that happens, for them to say, oh, you know what? I got my meal, they delivered it great. And I think for a lot of people that maybe they do want to tip, but they don't know how, or maybe they forget. I know that sounds like an excuse to a lot of delivery drivers, but that does make sense. There's been sometimes I get out of an Uber and I immediately have to go here and you know, I'm bouncing around, I have a lot of stuff going on. I'm like, oh shoot, I forgot to tip, and then I go back and do it. I can see a lot of people just forgetting to tip, right? I think this is only going to make it worse for delivery drivers. However, again, I think it's always important to look on both sides. I'm curious to see what will happen mathematically. That's what I want to hear from all my New York City delivery drivers. It could be that, yes, maybe you get less tips. And I can see that, I hate to say it, only being the case. And this is only going to hurt people getting tips, delivery drivers getting tips. That being said, though, I can see it being potentially a benefit, hear me out, just because of the end of the bottom line. Yes, maybe you might not get as many tips as you used to, but with the minimum hourly guarantee now, and with certain fees and all this kind of stuff coming into play, yeah, maybe I'm making this up, you might not get as many tips. But like say when you did all the math out, you typically made $12 an hour in New York City, including tips. Now you might make $20 an hour in New York City without tips. And yeah, you're getting less tips, but at the end of the day, you're still walking away with more money. I think this is I'm about to say Uber and Lyft. I think this is Uber Eats and DoorDash's overall mindset, which I still think is messed up, because I still think, like, you still should have the person ordering the food, you should still give them the ability to tip in the beginning, because let's be honest, for a lot of delivery drivers, they're probably going to start looking at this. They might not even know this for a lot of delivery drivers. There might be an alert, I don't know. But I can see a lot of delivery drivers pulling up the app and be like, wait, whoa, they didn't tip me. I'm not delivering this person's food, or I'm not going to accept the order even at all, or whatever. I can see a lot of delivery drivers not liking this, because a lot of delivery drivers have told me, like, yeah, you know, if I don't get a tip right in the beginning, that makes it worth my while to go all the way out of my way to the restaurant and then all the way to the person's place, I'm not going to accept the order. Now, though, you have no tips in the beginning, meaning the second you drop it off, I think it's way less likely for you to get a tip. However, my hope, just overall this, looking at the quick math, is that maybe at the end of the day, although you might get less tips, you'll still walk away with more money. However, with that being said, one, this is Uber Eats and DoorDash. It's such a habit to say Uber and Lyft. This is such a thing that Uber Eats and DoorDash is saying when it comes to their own analytics. So let's be honest, how true is it? Tough to say. And the second thing, as we all know, Uber Eats and DoorDash, and I'll include Lyft when it comes to this as well, always takes a massive amount out of your earnings. Typically with tips, you keep 100% of your tips. So yeah, maybe you might make $20 in an hour. But if you get no tips in that hour, and let's say Uber takes 40% of your earnings, they're taking away $8, you just actually made $12, as opposed to, like, say, if you made $16 and then, I don't know, I'm doing quick math right now, but like, if like say you made a certain amount or higher hourly amount, but a lot of that was tips, you might still make more money overall just because you're keeping more of that. You're retaining more of your money, right? If you factor in versus tips. Again, the math gets very tricky. I could probably do a more like hard mathematical analytical video. But like I said, this is the thing. Even if you're making more money an hour, Uber and Lyft, I guess I'll include Lyft for this too, because that kind of all comes in play. Uber, Lyft, Uber Eats, and Doordash, if you're making more amount an hour, they're taking more from you. As opposed to when you get those tips, you keep 100% of those tips. And that kind of worries me, being like, for all the delivery drivers in New York City, yeah, at first, Uber Eats and DoorDash are probably saying, hey, don't worry, you get this minimum hourly guarantee, which means you're going to be making more money an hour than you were before. Potentially true, but at the end of the day, at the bottom line, I don't know how this is going to go. I could see it going one way, like I said, trying to be optimistic, that yeah, maybe you might not make as much money with tips, but at the end of the day, you still walk away with more money because of the minimum hourly guarantee. On the other end, it could definitely be the case. Let's say you don't make that much money at all. You only make that minimum hourly guarantee. So you only make, let's say, $18 an hour with no tips. But then Uber Eats, DoorDash, etc. is taking such a big cut that you actually now walking away with less money. It's a tricky situation. And I think, at the end of the day, when it comes to something like this, only time will tell when it comes to the hard math if delivery drivers are going to make more money or less money after this happening.